What do you think of when you think of samurai? Skilled warriors, yes, but you also probably think of the concept of Bushido, supposedly the code of the samurai that emphasized honor and loyalty above all else. Except, one small problem, Bushido is a lie, made up at the turn of the 20th century in order to justify Japan's imperial designs on the rest of Asia. Actual samurai had never heard of Bushido, and had almost no concept of loyalty or honor. They were people, mostly mercenaries, who would almost without exception prefer to live rather than die, even if it meant they had to commit treachery. And perhaps, surprisingly, one of the few depictions of this in recent art comes from a video game, Total War Shogun 2. Total War Shogun 2 actually has 3 distinct time periods it is set in. The main setting, simply called Shogun 2, is set during the Sengoku Jidai. Rise of the Samurai is set during the Genpei War at the end of the Heian period. The final campaign, Fall of the Samurai, is set during the Boshin War at the end of the Shogunate. The fact that the game is split in 3 like this is the first complication to discussing its interpretation of the samurai. Samurai in Rise are very different from the samurai in Fall, and in order to be able to say anything meaningful at all, this discussion will focus on the Sengoku setting and campaign. In this campaign, the player assumes the role of the daimyo of a clan. Each clan has their own set of 4 unique traits that are inspired by the real-world clans they are based on. For example, the Shimazu clan of Satsuma have superior katana samurai, the Takeda clan have better cavalry, and so on. Not every trait is simply a better unit, however. The Yotomo start out as Christian, and as such have to deal with suppressing results from, and eventually converting, Buddhist peasants in the lands they conquer. The Ikoiki have no access to samurai at all, kind of, and instead they focus on warrior monks and militia Ashigaru troops. This complicates their recruiting process, as to gain access to higher-tier troops, they need both an Ikoiki monastery and the relevant training building, such as a Naginata dojo, in order to recruit their warrior monks. Throughout the course of the campaign, the player is tasked with leading their clan to the shogunate and become shogun. This requires the player to hold a certain amount of land and eventually conquer Kyoto itself. The strategic level campaign is turn-based, with each turn representing a season. At this level, the player moves armies, builds and upgrades buildings, manages diplomacy and trade, and researches new technology. The diplomatic and economic systems are very streamlined, and other daimyos are rarely receptive to diplomatic overtures. The strategic level gameplay tends to be a juggling act of several limiting factors: money, food surplus, public order, religion, foreign relations, territorial holdings, army positioning, and the use of agents such as ninjas, geishas, monks, and magistrates. In a battle, however, all of these concerns fall away. The battles are fought in real time between armies of about 2,000 soldiers to a side. The player is tasked with forcing the enemy's troops to rout and flee the battlefield. The player commands up to 40 units of a few hundred soldiers each, and each unit has their own stats such as melee attack, morale, armor, and accuracy. Most of these stats improve as the unit gains experience in combat. A unit of veteran katana samurai will outperform a unit that has never seen battle before. Experience also decreases as the unit takes losses and those casualties are replaced by new soldiers. At the tactical level, the game becomes about outpositioning your opponent, such as surrounding an isolated unit in an effort to get their army to break. When only one side's troops remain on the field, that side is won, and the losing army is either destroyed or retreats on the strategic map, depending on how many soldiers survived. At the end of the campaign, if the player is successful in becoming shogun, they are treated to a short cutscene and given the option to continue playing and conquer all of Japan. Functionally, however, the game has ended and the player has won. It is a little strange that the game just kind of trails off without much fanfare, but in reality, the player has probably actually won much earlier, or at least was in a winning position, and was only executing the series of actions that would make the game recognize this. The question of samurai representation in Shogun 2 is a complicated one. If I had a specific agenda, I could argue with complete conviction that the game either supports or counters the traditional depictions and cultural myths of samurai. To begin, the samurai as an individual warrior basically does not exist in Shogun 2. Samurai mostly exist in units of 160, in the case of melee troops, and 120 in the case of ranged troops. When 2 units meet in battle, the individual soldiers begin dueling each other, making battles both about army-level maneuvering and a series of a few thousand one-on-one duels. The victor of these duels is determined by the unit's stats, such as attack, defense, armor, morale, etc. If the other unit has not broken and run, the victor will more than likely engage in another duel immediately afterwards. The fact that victory in a battle means routing the enemy rather than destroying them means that the samurai in Shogun 2 are willing to flee a battle rather than die. This suggests a more pragmatic, realistic interpretation of the samurai. Complicating this slightly are the siege battles. Should a defending unit remain inside of the walls of the castle they are defending, they will fight to the death rather than attempt to flee. This is true for any unit, however, whether Ashigaru, samurai, or monk. Samurai are also able to be bribed to switch sides by a Metsuke agent, also reflecting historical understanding of the samurai as pragmatic mercenaries. Bribing an enemy army just before a key battle is a valid and effective tactic, not to mention historically accurate. There are some units, however, that are a little more on the mythic side. These are the 40-man unique hero units. It takes an absurd amount of time to be able to recruit a single one of these hero units. The player has to research to the end of a weapon's tech tree, which takes at least 40 turns, build the maximum level dojo for that weapon, and finally invest the funds to recruit the unit itself. At the end of this, the player is rewarded with a single unit of 40 soldiers that, to put it mildly, destroy anything in their path. To show you how overpowered they are, I altered the game to let me research any technology in a single turn. I then built an army made exclusively of these legendary troops, around 13 units in total. And then I conquered the entire map with this army while barely slowing down at all. These units take no attrition in winter, don't take that many casualties in battle, and take almost no time to recoup the losses that they do take, and they will almost never rout. Their stats are around 3 times better than any other unit, and if the player recruits them in a province that provides an armor buff, it is entirely likely that the player will be able to defeat a full-sized army of 2,500 people, with an army that numbers scarcely over 500, and all without losing more than 10 soldiers. These hero units are very powerful, very unique, and ultimately a little silly, but the time and money investment in recruiting them makes it impractical to field the army I described without cheating. In reality, each army will have 1 or 2 at maximum, in which case they can easily be surrounded or shot down by archers and arquebusiers. At the end of the day, hero units are the exception, rather than the rule, of Shogun 2's depiction of samurai. Based on what I've just said, one could assume that now I will say that Shogun 2 mostly rejects the popular image of the samurai as an honor and duty-obsessed super soldier. But that's not quite accurate. The actual gameplay aligns with the view of samurai as realistic human soldiers, rather than the mythical warriors made out entirely of honor and swords. But the game also comes with an in-game encyclopedia that explains how to use a unit and provides a short blurb providing some historical context for that unit. This blurb treats the samurai as that mythical figure, writing about historic deeds done by specific samurai and how ferociously they fought in combat. The cinematic opening that plays whenever the game is opened is a depiction of a duel of honor at a siege. The real-life siege is happening in winter, but when the two fighters actually cross blades, they are warped into a grove in springtime, as cherry blossom leaves gently float down. The gameplay suggests realism, but the presentation is all about the samurai as noble warriors. This presentation allows the developers to display popular samurai myths, but also present a realistic medieval Japan battle simulator, satisfying both demographics of players. Representing this dichotomy, in the opening, after the attacking samurai wins, he is dishonorably shot down by the defender's arrows. The game is deliberately trying to have both interpretations, both realistic and mythical at the same time. Later Total War titles, such as Three Kingdoms, Troy, and especially the Warhammer games, will lean much more into the ideas of history and myth blending together. It seems that Shogun 2 may have been the studio's first tentative exploration of that theme. The folks at Creative Assembly get a lot of credit for all the research they do for their games, and I think that's warranted. From the in-game encyclopedia entries, it's clear that they have read plenty and fully committed themselves to telling the story, or providing a sandbox, of Sengoku-era Japan. They worked hard to blend in the Total War style of combat of forcing a mass rout with the popular perception of samurai as indomitable warriors. And I think they succeeded, just not in the way that many expected. And this is where I get to say my controversial opinion about the game. Samurai aren't worth it. They're too expensive to maintain, they cost the entire value of a city per turn, and the upkeep and recruitment costs are far, far too high to actually have a full army of samurai in the early and mid-game. A couple of units in an army is fine, but an army of just samurai will bankrupt you and is not worth it. My go-to strategy is to build armorer buildings and recruit Yari Ashigaru, spear-armed peasants. They have a special ability called Yari Wall, which is just a tightly packed spear wall. The main advantage of this is that it keeps troops from approaching too close to the Ashigaru, meaning that a group of Yari Ashigaru surrounding a few samurai units will almost always win. And with the armor bonus from the armorer buildings, you can have Ashigaru with better armor than samurai. Their morale is lower at first, but that increases as the unit gains experience in battle. And that is the ultimate representation of samurai in Shogun 2. Whenever I play, the only samurai that I encounter are just meat for the Yari grinder, which, ultimately, is the most historically accurate part of the game. Oda Nobunaga, the first great unifier of Japan, was so successful because he was an early believer in the power of using both guns and long sticks. Nobunaga deployed thousands of firearm troops wielding Tanegashima, matchlock firearms, and supported them with more troops wielding very long Yari spears. These are represented in-game by long Yari Ashigaru, a unit available only to the Oda clan. At the Battle of Nagashino, he destroyed the pride of the Takeda clan not by fielding honorable katana samurai, but thousands of Ashigaru using guns and spears. The fact that this tactic is one of the most viable ones in-game, at both strategic and tactical levels, makes the game shockingly historically accurate, and provides a different narrative to samurai than one that we're used to in modern culture. I've been playing Shogun 2 off and on now for a decade, and I really like it, and its representation of samurai is definitely thought-provoking. In answering these questions, I've only covered a third of the game. I have much more to say about the fall of the samurai campaign, and how it is absolutely possible to win by using only traditional troops and ignoring the modern technology tree entirely. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video later, but at the very least, this game is one that seemingly invites critical discussion, and that is something that should be both recommended and emulated by other studios making games in historical settings. Any game that willingly and meaningfully engages in historiographical discussion should be praised, and the example set by Shogun 2 should be an inspiration to the rest of the gaming industry.